I began by quoting to Mrs. Thatcher a key line in the manifesto, The Next Moves Forward. It says, "Together we are building one nation, capital O, capital N, of free, prosperous and responsible families and people." But I put it to Mrs. Thatcher that many people in Britain would say that far from being one nation, the country is more divided than for many years, divided between north and south, between the employed and the unemployed, between the haves and the have-nots. In view of that, can she talk realistically of the one nation?
Oh, yes. I can talk about it as that is precisely what we're trying to achieve. And let me give the reasons why I can talk about it. The worst conflicts in this country have been through trade union strikes. You've seen coal strikes, the last one we fought. That coal strike was directed at everyone in manufacturing industry by trying to deprive them of the power to carry on, so it would have ruined manufacturing industry. It was directed at every household, every pensioner, by trying to deprive them of power and light. We fought it. We changed trade union law to replace that kind of conflict by cooperation. Yes, some of the conflict still continues. You saw the conflict at Wapping, where 500 policemen were injured. But we have changed trade union law, and over the great majority of manufacturing industry, we have replaced conflict with cooperation. That is the first point. Secondly, we have been the party which works for what we call a property-owning democracy, or power to the people. It's we who've enabled people to have the right to buy their council house, and we were fought all the way by the Labour Party and by many local labour authorities. It's we who've got rid of so many nationalised industries because we think governments ought not to be running them. They're better sold back to the people. And when we did it, said, look, let the people in that business, and some of the pensioners, in the case of gas, have a priority right to buy shares. And now where there were a few shareholders, there are now 8.5 million. It is we who are giving ordinary members of trade unions, ordinary people, the dignity of them mattering more in their trade union than the diktat of their trade union leaders, of giving them the right of property, of giving them the right of share ownership, and of saying, if you save out of your earnings, and it's we who've reduced taxation, then we're the party that wants to make your savings keep their value. It was Lenin, the revolutionary, who wanted to debauch the value of the currency. So steadily, yes, we are building one nation. We are, and we're doing it by power and by property to the people and by rights to the people, which this Labour manifesto would extinguish because they would repeal our trade union legislation.
You talk of restoring dignities, but what do you say to the charge that there is an even greater indignity, the indignity of unemployment? How can you talk about a nation being prosperous when more than 1 in 10 is unemployed?
Because you know and I know, and everyone knows, that there's no way in which a government can guarantee a job for every person. No way in a free society. Yes, they can do it if you run a Soviet society, when you're not allowed to take a job. You're only allowed to have the job, which the government allocates for you. So you have total direction of labour, no freedom at all. You cannot do it in a free society. What we have done is try to get manufacturing industry, by our trade union legislation, which in fact has replaced conflict by cooperation, into a very competitive, good competitive order, exporting more than it ever has done before. There's a very good base now of manufacturing industry. There's an excellent base of the service sector. Now, then it can expand. And since the last election, under the kind of government which we run, it is not governments who've created the jobs. Jobs come from business. But since we last did this in the last election, Mr. Clough, over 1 million jobs have been created. We weren't rash and promised them. We thought that under our system they would come to be created. They have. The population of working age has been rising faster than the number of jobs being created. That reverses, of course, in the early 1990s. But for the last 10 months, unemployment has been falling. But again, I have to, in all honesty, make it clear. No government can promise every person a job. What we can do, and are doing, is saying, look, there are jobs which employers can't fill. We can train you for jobs. We can make it so that you're much more likely to get a job than now, or much more likely to be able to start up on your own. And that is working.
You say, and I hear what you say, and I can't deny it, of course, that unemployment is falling and that many jobs have been created. The fact remains, though, doesn't it, that unemployment here is far higher, double the rate, than it is in the Big Six, in the United States, Canada, France, Italy, Germany.
It is higher here than it is in the United States, higher here than it is in Japan. And when people say that the answer is to spend a bigger proportion, more money on unemployment, those two actually give the lie to that as a recipe. Because in the United States, a much smaller proportion of the national income is spent by government. In Japan, a much smaller proportion of the national income is spent by government. More money is left in the hands of industry and in the hands of people. And therefore, because more money is left in their hands, they are more creative at creating the new jobs of the future. But that is, if I might put it this way, directly opposite to the policies of the Labour Party. And when I go over to the States, sometimes I envy President Reagan in that he says, look, since I've been president, I think it's something like 9 or even more million jobs have been created, not by government, but by you, the people. They have a very different social security system from the one we do, and we can't change to theirs. But it is they who give opportunity, and it's a very self-reliant society, and they create the jobs. It's business that creates the jobs, and we have been freeing up business to do more of that, and it's working.
I know that you have talked and do talk with compassion and concern about the unemployed people. You talked about the humiliation of being unemployed. This was in that Conservative broadcast that has been dug up, the broadcast in 1977, when you said that if there had been a Conservative government in office with unemployment at a level of 1.3 million, which the Labour government had at that time, you would have been drummed out of office. Do those words haunt you at all now?
No, they don't haunt me, because we were returned in 1979, because the then policies being run by the Labour government, my goodness me, if you wanted division and conflict and lack of caring and compassion, you saw it in 1979. The strikes, the hospital strikes, that's when waiting lists went up, you know. And we had strikes of hospital workers. That's when really people were made to suffer as the unions took over the country. And people put us back in office, and they reconfirmed us in 1983. And I think it is this, because they know that in a free society, governments simply cannot just create jobs for everyone. They know that business is far better off in creating a far higher standard of living now. And out of that higher standard of living is actually coming a higher standard of care. We're not a party that talks a great deal about care. I was always taught not to, or to suspect people who talk big and do little. So we talk very little about it. But we've actually delivered it. And the reason why we've delivered it is because we have had the policies. And let me say this, as a person who's been through a very, very great deal. The reason why I've been through fighting coal strikes, fighting the left-wing trade union members, fighting people like the picket lines at Wapping, fighting those things, fighting to get a better deal for people who wanted to buy their own houses, is because I care very deeply about the British character, about individuals having dignity. I don't like treating people as block votes. That is not, to me, personal liberty. Personal liberty is, to me, saying each of you has your dignity.
What are you going to do about VAT in this next government if you're elected? Are you going to extend its range? You're accused of planning to put it on fuel and food.
Well, you asked me what we are going to do about VAT. The rate of the Labour Party spending, they would have to put up both income tax and VAT very sharply indeed.
Well, perhaps next week I can ask Mr. Kinnock what they're going to do. Perhaps you could tell me what you're going to do.
As far as I am concerned, we have said that we will continue to have zero rating on food. That is quite crucial. We get that scare every single election. At the moment, there is a case under the present law being taken against us in the European Court on housing. That is whether we're entitled under present law to have a zero rating on housing construction. We're fighting that case with all our might and main, and will continue to do so. That is under present European law. The question then arises about electricity and gas, about fuel. It is not our intention to put VAT on those things.
Could I ask you to clarify something else which became a bone of contention and may indeed still be a bone of contention in the remainder of the campaign. This business of schools which will be given the option, if you're returned, of opting out of local educational authorities and being directly funded by the state. Now, something that you said seemed to suggest that parents might be asked to pay fees. That was then denied. But you're still talking about alternative funding or additional funding. What sort of additional funding for these schools?
Well, state schools now can raise additional funding.
You mean talking about raffles and things?
Well, sometimes they can raise additional funding with the help of a local industrialist, if they wish to do so, and if they wish. I go round schools, and many times you'll go round and you'll look at the number of computers in schools, and you'll know that we had a policy, we were one of the first in Europe, so there should be microcomputers in every school. And you'll go round, you'll see whole banks of them, and they will say, well, they were given to us, or we raised money for them. But when we get these schools, and let me make it quite clear, what we're trying to do, let's make the policy quite clear. Can I explain it from the beginning? It is the local educational authorities that have control over the curriculum in education. At the moment, government has no control, save that it says there must be some religious education. Local educational authorities have control over the curriculum and the way in which the schools are run, unless it is a voluntary aided when it is the governors. Now, don't think that is free. It is paid for by rates and taxes, and we all pay for it. Now, some parents and some children are not getting a good education. Nevertheless, they're paying for it by rates and by taxes. Now, look at their position. They're greatly dissatisfied with what their children are being taught. Sometimes with what their children are being taught, they don't like the things they're being taught. Sometimes they think their children should be taught things they're not being taught. They're trapped at the moment. The local educational authority is saying, this is what we say you shall have an education, take it or leave it. No person should be put in that position. So what we are saying is right. If you're really dissatisfied, then you, the parents and governors of the school, can get together and say to the Secretary of State for Education, we want our school not to come under the local educational authority. We want it to come under the Secretary of State for Education, who says, I don't want direct control. I want it to form an educational trust, and the powers shall come to that educational trust to run that school, and the money will be found, exactly the same amount of money as the local educational authority schools get, shall go to that school. That is an extra choice. There shall be no fees charged to the parents. This is an extra chance, an extra opportunity, an extra choice given to parents. It's really conservative. It's power to the people. It's give them choice. Don't tell them what they've jolly well got to have. Say if you don't like it, we'll give you an extra chance to have something different.
So the pledge is no fees, no additional parental contribution, no contribution for books.
What do you mean additional parental contribution? There isn't a parental contribution. There are no fees. Yes, if the school wishes to try to raise money in other ways, that is already done. Yes, if they wish to go to their local industry and say, look, will you help us to get something extra? Who are we to stop them? It is fascinating to me that three-quarters of the Labour propaganda and their Labour programme is trying to stop people from doing things from which they would profit and benefit. The important thing is that money could not be raised by the imposition of fees on parents. I've said this again and again. There's a totally misleading Labour advertisement about this. They know it's misleading. They're still going on with it. These are schools paid for by the taxpayer. It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is. Yes, you should have the right for your children to have a good education. You are already paying for it through rates and taxes.
There are very many other things that we could talk about. Our time, I'm afraid, is running close to its end.
They're big questions you're asking.
Well, yes, and there's another big one now. Could I ask you very finally about the defence policy of the Conservative Party? Is it not predicated on a real belief in a Soviet threat, a belief that that nice Mr. Gorbachev, with whom you had such pleasant talks in Moscow, really wants to come and invade this country, and is only going to be deterred from doing so by the possession of Trident?
Do you know, Mr. Clough, that's the sort of question I didn't expect you, of all people, to ask. We went to war that Poland and Czechoslovakia should be free. Are Poland and Czechoslovakia free? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary. The first uprising came in 1953, East Germany. It was put down. The second in 1956, Hungary. It was put down. Several in Poland. The next one, 1968-69, Czechoslovakia. They were put down by Soviet tanks. Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. It is still there. 5 million people have fled. When the Americans left Vietnam, a communist country, you would have thought that Vietnam would turn around and say, now we're going to really raise the standard of living and look after the people. Not a bit of it. Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, turned round and attacked its neighboring Cambodia. And you say there's no threat? How utterly absurd. Ask the people who live the other side of the Berlin Wall. Still up. No, when I go to see Mr. Gorbachev, I go to see, knowing the measure of the man, he's a very considerable person, knowing whom I'm negotiating with, and he knows who he's negotiating with. I go to see him as a very strong leader. He meets me as a very strong leader. And we negotiate as strong leaders because we have one thing in common. Well, I have one thing in common, that being strong, he wishes to defend his way of life and his system. I am determined to defend ours. It is in our interest that there be no future conflict. That is the basis on which I go as a sure defendant of freedom and justice in Britain and NATO.
The leader of the Conservative Party, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher.